1915, in the midst of World War I. Glasgow was booming. The shipyards were working all the time, 7 days a week. And of course, housing was very, very scarce. People were squeezed into flats. You'd have maybe 2 rooms for a whole family of 6 or 7 people. And of course, maintenance was horrendous. The flats weren't well heated in the winter. That was just very, very, very poor housing. So that was the background out of which came the Great Rent Strike of 1915. In the shipyards, they were working full time, more than full time actually, 7 days a week, trying to produce warships for World War I, and thus this was Glasgow was a vital part of the war effort. In fact, the British government took very seriously what was happening on the Clyde, because an awful lot of the ships that were fighting the Germans came out of Glasgow and the Clyde. So that was the context in which all this was happening. In that situation, the landlords started raising the rents because housing was scarce. They could get away with it. And in response to that, the women of Govan organized a rent strike. So they stopped paying the rents. And the rent strike started spreading from Govan throughout other parts of Glasgow. And of course, the landlords tried to respond, and their first response was to send out bailiffs to evict the people who weren't paying rent. But there were popular protests. The women were mobilized in the neighborhood, and they would block the bailiffs from coming in and start throwing flour bags at the bailiffs, and the bailiffs would finally withdraw. So that was the context in which the landlords decided the next step they would do is they would collect the rent by deducting from the wages of the shipyard workers. The production in the shipyards was so vital, gave the shipyard workers a certain leverage, a certain amount of power, and they were organized, and they used it. Now, of course, the government tried to suppress discontent in the shipyards as much as they could, and strikes were illegal. But nonetheless, they happened. They were short, quickie strikes quite often in the shipyards during World War I. Definitely, the rent strikes didn't happen out of nothing. They were organized. They were organized by women who, in fact, were experienced political people. They had been militant suffragists before this, and they were in an organization called the Independent Labor Party as well, a socialist organization. But absolutely, it was organized. The rent strike was organized in Govan by that core group, and it swept in all kinds of people, initially women and then the shipyard workers. And it was an extremely exhilarating experience, because here they were on the move. They were mobilizing tens of thousands of people. They were having an impact. They couldn't be ignored. And eventually they won a victory. So it was a huge boost to everybody's morale. Okay, well, when the thousands of people marched on the Sheriff's Court, it was a big event. Again, part of that reason that was true was a lot of the men came along with their wives. And when they did that, they left the shipyards, which meant the shipyards were shut down in the midst of the war. So it was a huge event. And when they got to the Sheriff's Court, they came from different parts. One march came from Govan, but there were marches from other parts of the city as well. And they all converged on George Square and then the Sheriff's Court. So there were the streets around the Sheriff's Court were blocked with protesters, and some of the leaders would get on sandwich boards from the newspaper kiosk. They would be held up by some sturdy men, and they would give speeches on top of that. So it's hard to visualize, but they didn't have microphones. They just bellowed. And one of those was John McLean. John McLean was one of the people on the sandwich boards, denouncing the landlords and calling for a rent freeze. So here was all the streets around the Sheriff's Court in the city center of Glasgow were blocked, and the protesters sent a delegation of shipyard workers into the sheriff to meet with the sheriff. They told the sheriff if any of the people involved were evicted because they refused to pay the rent, there would be a strike at the shipyards. And the sheriff called up Lloyd George, who at the time was Minister of Munitions, and said, there's going to be a strike at the shipyards in Glasgow, what should we do? And Lloyd George said, "We will make sure that rents are frozen during the war," and they were. So there was a victory, a huge victory, and it wasn't not just important in and of itself. It was good that they froze the rents, but it showed the power that people had if they could mobilize, organize around a concrete issue, and actually show their power.